Welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Bereavement Support, Connecting Along the Journey. Today's webinar is the latest in a series produced by a collaborative project between the National Perinatal Association's Family Advocacy Network and the NICU Parent Network. We've created these resources as part of our shared mission to support NICU families and their advocates. You can see our past webinars by visiting either of our websites. We hope you'll see them in what we present here today as valuable resources that support the work you do. This NPN and NPA webinar series will focus on bereavement support and bridging the gap between support providers to provide families with support throughout their bereavement journey. Our objectives for today's webinar are to understand current bereavement care. Also, to identify gaps in support for bereavement families throughout their journey. And lastly, to provide action steps and talking points to bereavement support providers to begin to close the gaps. I'm your host today, Tracy Pella. Some of my proudest accomplishments are being a wife and the mom to 3 children on earth and 1 in heaven. As the co-founder and president of Connected Forever, a nonprofit organization based here in Nebraska, some of my professional and personal experience paired with my passion and commitment to NICU life, along with pregnancy and infant loss, has made me a valuable resource for both families and professionals. And I'm excited to be here as your host today. Our presenters, Joyce Merrigan and Rebecca Mitchell. Dr. Merrigan is a clinical specialist, a dynamic, passionate educator, a labor and delivery nurse, perinatal bereavement coordinator, and traumatic grief counselor. She actively collaborates on the ANCC Magnet, Baby Friendly USA, and OB safety committees, and chairs the Obstetric Hemorrhage Multidisciplinary Committee at Capitol Health in New Jersey. Dr. Merrigan collaborated with the National Perinatal Association for the practice statement on bereavement care for miscarriage in the emergency department and is a member of several professional organizations. She was a member of the Partnership for Maternal and Child Health of Northern New Jersey and served on the Perinatal Bereavement and Fetal Infant Mortality Review Boards. Joyce advocated on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. for respectful disposition of fetal remains and is a published author, a national and international speaker, advocating for bereavement education for nurses, providing care to women experiencing pregnancy loss. She is board certified in obstetrics, perinatal loss care, compassionate bereavement care, and is a trauma-informed provider. She provides traumatic grief counseling to families navigating birth trauma and perinatal loss. She earned a doctorate in nursing practice from Capella University and is a clinical specialist for the Maternal Child Services Division at Capitol Health Medical Center in New Jersey. Rebecca Mitchell is the founder and president of Mommies Enduring Neonatal Death, better known as MEND, which was founded in 1996, 1 year following the stillbirth of her son, Jonathan Daniel. MEND is a Christian nonprofit organization based in Irving, Texas, that reaches out to families who have suffered the loss of a baby due to miscarriage, stillbirth, or early infant death. MEND has chapters across Texas and several other states. Rebecca also serves on the board of directors for the nonprofit organization Perinatal Support of Texas, as well as the Methodist Dallas Hospital Foundation Board of Trustees. Additionally, Rebecca sits on the Dallas County Committee of Fetal Infant Loss Review. Further, Rebecca is the North Texas contact for the National SIDS Alliance and is also the founding organizer of the DFW Pregnancy and Infant Loss Comfort Connection. Several times each year, Rebecca is asked to give presentations to hospitals across North Texas on how to better care for patients following the death of a baby and speaks at various moms groups on how to respond to parents who suffer pregnancy or infant loss. Outside of MEND, Rebecca serves as a class administrator for the Dallas Irving Bible Study Fellowship International BSF class. Rebecca and her husband of 32 years, Byron, live in Irving, Texas. They have one living son, Byron Jr., who lives with his wife, Anna, and son Elias Jonathan in Kansas City, Missouri. We are honored to have these presenters here with us today. Hello, Joyce and Rebecca.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for having me.
Hi, thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, let's go ahead and get started and jump right into our topic. So our first question for today is following our objective of understanding current bereavement care. Joyce, what is the biggest way bereavement support has changed during your career?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. I would say that over the course of the last 20 years, 18 of which I've spent very involved in perinatal bereavement care in the hospital setting, the things that I've seen the largest change or shift in are beginning with the fear of the skills that the providers have to care for patients who are experiencing a loss. So over the course of the past 18 years, I've seen that providers have received more in-depth, more robust education at the unit level from their supporting leadership in order to provide them with the communication skills and also resources that they need in order to provide the best care for their patients in the hospital. The second thing that I've seen is that there has been a large push to incorporate perinatal bereavement acknowledgement/awareness into the narrative of curriculum for medical school and nursing school curriculum. That's been a huge support over the last few years. We're seeing providers coming out of school with at least a baseline understanding of bereavement care, as opposed to being surprised that we need to focus on bereavement care because, labor and delivery is always the happy place. Nothing terrible ever happens there. That was always the understanding of new providers. So that's not the case any longer. They're coming out of school with an understanding of that concept. And then the final thing that I've seen, which is of utmost importance and power, is the parent's voice. The advocacy from parents who have experienced the loss of a child is so strong and has been effective in creating some substantial change in the area of bereavement support.
Thank you, Joyce. As a mother of a bereaved child, I can speak to, I've seen a lot of those areas and also providing direct support to families experiencing that bereavement. I will never forget the time a labor and delivery nurse told me, everyone thinks that my job is only happiness. And it's families like yours that really allow me to learn and grow and to really understand how to better serve families and the families that come behind you. So thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Those parents come with me every day. They're always with me.
Well, we appreciate that. Rebecca, would you like to speak to how bereavement support has changed throughout your time?
Sure, and I definitely 100% agree with Joyce's comments. And just to add to that, what I have noticed when my Jonathan was stillborn in 1995 here in my area of North Texas was just about the time when the hospital started recognizing the need and the importance of families spending more time with their baby and making memories. In generations past, the babies were whisked away. Oftentimes, the parents did not get to see their baby, spend time with the baby. Sometimes they didn't even know if they delivered a full-term baby boy or girl. So we have definitely seen the change of that for the better, of just recognizing and understanding how important it is for us to spend time with our babies and to make those memories. Secondly, I have seen over the years of, just as Joyce talked about, that our healthcare providers are understanding that they need that bereavement education, but not just the education from people who have an alphabet behind their name, right? That they understand that those of us who have lost a baby are the experts. We often call ourselves as we are experts by experience. So I've seen over the years more invitations and the willingness to allow those of us who are the moms who have experienced this firsthand to come in and train the healthcare providers.
I have seen that also, Rebecca, and thank you for speaking to that. I do feel like even in my time as a provider over the last 9 years, that has changed, and that parent voice is being brought to the table. So what an important piece that is, um, and an amazing thing as we continue to evolve bereavement care, which leads us into the next topic. Rebecca, how would you describe the current culture of bereavement care and where we are today in providing that care to families?
I think we've gotten so much better. Again, just here in the Dallas area, I have seen such a change of where the nurses are more accepting and understand the importance of parents like us who have experienced a loss spending time with our baby. Again, my Jonathan was stillborn in 1995, and when I was actually in the hospital on bed rest with kidney complications when he became completely entangled in the umbilical cord. So his death was a cord accident and had nothing to do with why I was in the hospital. I was there under 24-hour observation, and he still died, which was quite a shock to everybody on the floor. I had been there for quite a while. I had a friend who worked in labor and delivery who happened to be working the day that Jonathan died. So she came running up to my room and she explained to me what would happen, that I got to have a C-section. So she explained to me what would happen, what to expect, and things like that. And one of the things that she was very, very emphatic about was you've got to spend time with him, and you can have him in your room for as long as you want. He can spend the night in your room, or he can go to the morgue at night, things like that. Well, I didn't know any different. I thought that's what everybody did. So that's what we did. We had him in our room for hours the night he was delivered. We had him in our room for about 12 hours the next day. My husband and I had him for about 2 hours the third day before the funeral home came to get him. He did spend the night in the morgue. But again, that's what I thought everybody did. It wasn't until later I found out that the nurses didn't know what in the world to think of how we were handling this, and had to have a number of think tank sessions with the social workers and the chaplains and things like that. And they discovered, well, actually, we think the way the Mitchells did it is probably a very healthy way. And again, I didn't realize at the time that that's not what everybody did. So that is what I have seen evolve over the years. And I think our current culture is to allow the families to spend time with the babies. Also, back in the day, if a family had an autopsy, their time was very shortened with their babies. Now, not quite so much. And then just to add to that, I think with our current culture of bereavement care, what I'm still seeing a little bit of is some of the older nurses that are still not used to this new way of families spending time with their babies and creating the memories. They're maybe not quite as accepting as some of these younger nurses, and we're trying to train them from the get-go before they even get out of nursing school that this is what you do, and this is what is acceptable, and this is the healthy way.
Well, thank you for sharing that experience, Rebecca, and for being a pioneer in what bereavement care looks like today. Joyce, do you
Sure.
have thoughts to add to that in the current culture of bereavement care?
Thank you very much for that. I would be happy to share that. That brings me to my major point that I would like to make is, Rebecca, the power of the patient's story. The story that you shared was a beautiful story and one that you can reflect back on over for many, many years. It's the experience of the older nurses that they would whisk the baby away, and it would be unusual for them to have family members in the room to see a baby who had died. They've seen the changes over the course of their career, and they've had to change their practice accordingly. So the power of that patient's story and understanding that they, the provider, have the ability to make that profound impact, not only in those moments and hours with their baby after delivery, but also how profoundly it impacts the grief trajectory after discharge. That would be something I would also like to talk about a little bit more, is that the narratives and the cultural expectations of bereavement and the grief journey need to be talked about, I think, more openly. I think that we still have approximately 4.2 million women globally who suffer from depressive symptoms, and they suffer in silence because the cultural expectations for how they should be grieving um, are really not realistic expectations for grief.
Yes, Joyce, I do agree that that cultural piece is huge and making sure that that is at the forefront of conversations, and understanding as providers, and as parents providing that support also is that grief is different, in every experience and every journey, and really understanding and allowing us to provide that support, and in the utmost caring way for families.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the things as providers we are charged with preparing our patients with is that there's going to be many, many times after discharge where they're going to be responsible for perpetuating that narrative, even at times where they feel like they don't want to be the person responsible for that. So when they hear people say, oh, well, you're still grieving, or you should be over that by now, and these are things that women hear over and over again, that expectation that there's the end of the journey in grief, and that at some point in time you no longer hurt and that you shouldn't be grieving any longer. That's something we definitely need to prepare them for, and that there are going to be times where they're going to have to say to people, it's okay for me to still be grieving. This is my journey. And it is their journey, and it is individual, as you said, and there is no end to grief. It's a matter of families learning to live with who they've become as a result of their experience. They will never be the person they were before they experienced that loss. They are a couple or an individual moving forward with the experience of that loss, and that changes them forever.
If I could just tag on to that a little bit, Joyce is reminding me, several years ago, we had a counselor here in our area who created a survey on pregnancy and infant loss. And my leadership were kind of her guinea pigs of testing her survey questions first. So it was my board of directors and advisory board and our national chapter directors. There were probably about 20 of us. And we ranged from having our loss over 20 years ago, and some of the fresher ones were with maybe less than 5 years. One of the questions on our survey was, how often do you still think about your baby that died? And it was, the answers very often, sometimes not very often, kind of those lines of answers. And like 98% of us answered the question very often. So she came to me and said, I am very concerned about your women in leadership, that they still think about their baby very often after so many years. Because after so many years, y'all shouldn't be thinking about your baby so often. And I said, says who? A textbook?
Exactly. Exactly.
And I mean, has anybody ever asked all of us moms that are 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years out from our losses? So maybe those textbooks need to be rewritten, because, yeah, we think about our babies all the time. Maybe we don't talk about them all the time, but we think about them all the time.
Absolutely. And share with me, Rebecca, if you agree with what I'm about to say, which is that we have to continue to say their names. So I remember many years ago when I was a perinatal bereavement coordinator for another hospital, and I would keep in touch with moms. I would call them at the 6-month mark, 1 year mark, and I would continue to call several of them every 6 months to a year for many years after their losses. And they would cry because they would expect my loss, and they would start to cry, and they would say, this is the only time I can say their name. You're the only person who can say their name. And I think that impacted me on a very visceral level. The conversation that I have on an ongoing basis is to say their name. Always use their names, and include them in family gatherings and celebrations. And many families have held a place for them at dinner tables and things like that. And that's absolutely normal and healthy. Whereas many years ago, people would be concerned about somebody who would do something like that. but I don't see that there's anything detrimental. Quite to the contrary, I think it's beneficial for people to remember that child. I think that it helps the parents and the family to continue on their grief journey, knowing that nobody's forgotten their child, because that's
Right,
part of
right.
their grief as well, is that they feel they're alone in their grief and that nobody remembers their child.
That's right. And that's if you poll women who have experienced a loss, that's what they say is their number one fear of the grief journey is that over time people will forget.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what I've found in private practice as well. Those are things that people just, they can't assimilate into their grief journeys. Why can't people just remember my child? And why do they respond the way they do when I remember my child? And that's very sad. So I think that as a society and in culture, we need to continue that narrative and to make it something more commonplace. Just when you look back to a conversation like SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, there was a time where we didn't talk about those things, and now it's common. We talk about it all the time. It's well known in the general population about what SIDS is, and we don't fear that conversation anymore. I remember going back probably about 5, 10 years ago, there were facilities that didn't want to put perinatal support groups on their websites because they didn't want anybody to think that they had babies who died in their hospitals. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, we definitely have to change that narrative, because I think that's another thing that I had wanted to talk about was the prenatal expectations as well, is that a lot of moms, most moms, they're not prepared for the fact that their baby could die. So when it does happen to them, that's one of the first things they say is, I didn't know this could happen to me, you
Right.
know? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, Joyce. As a mom of a angel, I've in working with other moms, I often hear that chapter is not in the "What to Expect When You're Expecting" book, and so
Yeah, I
those
was just about to say the same thing.
those conversations happen a lot within our community of lost moms. So, well, Joyce, I want to thank you, and Rebecca. That discussion that you guys just had was incredible, and I think the most powerful thing I heard there was that we need to empower families to continue the narrative. That's something I'm going to take away and continue to use in the work that I do. And hopefully those of you listening can really understand the power of that statement, is because the narrative does need to continue for all of us to improve the care that we provide. And that really bridges us perfect into our next objective and question. So there's different areas of bereavement care, and we could spend probably hours talking about the different kinds of pregnancy and infant loss, where they may occur, how they may occur. But I would like us to just take a little bit of time to spend on identifying some of the overarching gaps that we see in bereavement care that a family may be experiencing during their journey. Would either one of you like to start on that topic?
I will always raise my hand. Is that okay with you, Rebecca?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So I've identified many gaps in bereavement care, and of course this was a large piece of my doctoral work, which was the gap in care provided to women who miscarry. So here in New Jersey, we have over 20 weeks and under 20 weeks. So there's a legal demarcation as to what's considered
Hmm.
a stillbirth versus what's considered a miscarriage. So what I had identified as a gap here, and it's like this in many areas in the country, is that what we provide to women who are experiencing a stillbirth, it's much different. It's more inclusive in the labor and delivery setting. However, when we're talking about women who've miscarried in the ED setting or even at home, what we're able to provide to those women and families is much different. And what I had discovered is one of the major differences is that the skill set. So emergency nurses have a large set of barriers to care. They certainly can't do everything that a labor and delivery nurse can do for a patient, because they have other things that they're responsible for, traumas coming in and, gunshot wounds, whatever their situations might be in their emergency departments. So the first thing that we needed to do was to identify what they could do for patients. And the major thing that they can do is to simply acknowledge the miscarriage as a loss. That is a major skill that we can provide to our nurses, that it's okay to acknowledge a miscarriage as a loss. The other thing that we can do is we can certainly provide them with a miscarriage kit or a comfort kit, which are items that are always available to patients for use, whether it be a hat to be putting on the toilet for when they use the bathroom so that they're not miscarrying into the toilet. And most toilets are automatic flushers. So that trauma of using the bathroom while you're in the emergency department and having your miscarriage in the toilet and it flushes. I can't even imagine the trauma that a woman would feel as a result of that. So something so simple as to just be thoughtful of the fact that that could happen while the woman is there in the hospital. I think that's pretty important. One of the things that you had mentioned in my bio was the interdisciplinary guidelines for the care of women presenting to the emergency department with miscarriage. So that was a position statement published by the National Perinatal Association, which goes into a lot more detail about the care we can provide in the ED for women who miscarry. Another thing that we need to think about also is the process in the hospital, which is an area that we don't often think about or identify as a cause for continued pain and grief and suffering for a family. So the simplicity of releasing remains for burial or cremation can be an area that can impose deeper pain for a family because the processes internally aren't streamlined so that it's a seamless process. So that's something that can be worked on in hospitals to kind of streamline those processes. And then also follow up by providers and by hospitals checking in on women after they've been discharged. A simple phone call to say, hey, how are you doing today? You know, one of the nurses that I had worked with during my doctoral work, she was an emergency room nurse, and she very thoughtfully said to me, you know, we call patients with lab results. Why can't we call them after they've miscarried just to see how they are? You know, it was one of those aha moments, and that was something that they were able to incorporate in their care of women after discharges, just to check in on them to see how they are. And then access to counseling after discharge, that's something else that we need to do some work on as well. There's a lot of online resources for women, although I would highly caution women and families to be cautious about online support and to make sure that it's appropriate for what they're seeking. I don't like to acknowledge this, but there are a lot of support groups online that aren't really looking to lift up or to move grief forward in a healthy way. Although there are a lot that are very helpful and beneficial. If I could just spend some time talking about a few of those. One of them is called Unite. There's also Good Grief, A Place to Remember, Bereaved Parents of the USA, Centering Corporation, Climb, Compassionate Friends, Grieving Dads, the March of Dimes, the Miss Foundation, the International Stillbirth Alliance, the Blossom Method, the Star Legacy Foundation, National Share, and Stillbirth CDC. They have a web page for healthcare professionals' role in stillbirth. And of course, MEND, Mommy's Enduring Neonatal Death, is an amazing resource as well. Thank you, Rebecca, for that one.
Oh, no, thank you for that plug.
Oh, my goodness. We use your resources here in our NICU. Amazing. You're amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce, for those identifying some of those gaps that we're seeing in bereavement care. Rebecca, I would love to hear from you in some of the gaps that you are able to identify within a family's journey.
Sure, and I speak from the perspective of a family journey, not only my own experience, but also the experiences of countless families that have walked the same grief. And I would just begin with, I think sometimes when a mom is in the hospital, and I certainly don't mean to leave out the dad or the other family members, but we women are the ones who deliver the little babies. And so were sort of the focus of attention at that point. And one of the things that I've noticed, myself included, is when something like this happens, first of all, most of the time, most of us go into shock. I could not believe my baby died while I was in the hospital for something completely different. I was in complete shock. I was one of those moms, I didn't know this happened. I didn't even know what the actual term stillbirth meant. No one even explained it to me. It was months before I even knew to use the word stillbirth. So I think that's one thing is, for the healthcare providers to not be afraid to use these words and kind of give us some verbiage to use, and to realize that when this happens and we are in shock, you may not see your patient cry very much. I don't know that I cried very much in the hospital because I was immediately numb and in shock. And I think sometimes when that happens, the providers think, oh, well, she's not really that sad, or she's not really affected by it that much, not realizing that this is just step one of a lifetime. What happens in the hospital is nothing like what happens when we go home and start processing this grief, and that shock wears off. We realize, oh my gosh, this really happened. We have to go forward to that new normal and develop that new normal in our lives, because we can no longer go back to normal, because what was once normal in our life will never be normal again. There were times that I would walk by my nursery in my house and literally just crumple to the floor. And I'm not really that dramatic of a person, but I didn't know how I could function the rest of my life, even though I had a 3-year-old at home who was the delight of our lives. I could not imagine how I was going to function the rest of our lives without our Jonathan. And so I think just the healthcare providers realizing that, man, this journey has not even begun yet when these families go home. And also just, we've talked about this a little bit, but that this loss affects us for the rest of our lives, no matter how many years pass, no matter how many more children we may or may not go on to have. Tracy, as you're well aware, we know when that baby should have started kindergarten. We may not tell everybody, but we know when that baby should have started kindergarten. We know when that baby should have started junior high, high school, Sweet 16. I made the mistake of looking up the date of the school that I'm assuming Jonathan would have attended when he should have graduated from high school. When our living son got married, it was kind of a dilemma of who he was going to choose as his best man, because his brother was dead. And so all of these things nobody really realizes affect us forever. A year and a half ago, when my daughter-in-law and son announced that they were pregnant, I cried for 3 straight months. I can't even tell you why, but I think it was because I was so afraid they would experience what we did. And actually, there were complications during delivery. Thank God our little Elias Jonathan is here safely at 15 months old now. But during the labor process with some complications, I had a complete meltdown in the waiting room where I went a little psychotic for a little bit, screaming, this cannot happen to our family again. They lost his heartbeat twice. And so, again, just that trauma resurrected within me that I would have never thought in a million years would have happened to me. But the point is just for providers to realize that it's traumatic, and it's something that affects us for the rest of our lives. And that goes on even to moms that are experiencing a subsequent pregnancy or a subsequent delivery or even a subsequent loss, why their emotions may be stronger than one would imagine.
Absolutely. If I could interject here, Rebecca, thank you for sharing that perspective. It's so important for providers to hear, but also to validate for other families experiencing a loss that all of the things that they're experiencing are normal, and it's a shared experience, because all families who've lost a child are going to experience these things as well. So thanks for perpetuating that narrative. I appreciate that. But if I could ask both you and Rebecca, Tracy, about what do you think would be the most beneficial action by a provider in the follow-up period what do you think would help you the most, be most supportive of you, and what do you think would be most detrimental?
Tracy, do you want to answer?
Yep, I sure can. I think for me, Joyce, and what I see in the families that we support was that connection. I will never forget when we lost our son, we were handed literally piles of information and we were signing things, we were given items, which was all appreciated and amazing. Yet in those piles of information was the community support groups. They were the groups of moms, of families, of events that we could remember our child, that we could feel like we were part of that community. And it wasn't until months later that someone had asked me if I had taken part in that community event. And, they said the hospital had given you information. And I went back to look through those piles. And yes, it was there. The folder was there with all of the information. But
Mhm.
just like Rebecca said before, we were in shock. We actually delivered our twin boys at 23 weeks and 4 days. And our son passed away the day he was born. And so we had lived through so much trauma and so much information that, and I would speak to, I probably didn't come out of that trauma and fog for years. But months later, having somebody to connect with me to share those community resources, and to know that, I think would have been very helpful, beyond that, those first few days and weeks of our losing our son. And to speak a little bit to something that was detrimental, I can actually, unfortunately, share that event also. Our local hospital would call and have a follow-up, which I think is crucial. I think, just like you said earlier, Joyce, hearing someone say my son's name, to be asking how I was, they would send us books, they would send us letters, all of which was so meaningful, because for me, one of the things is definitely hearing his name, but seeing his name in print was amazing. It brought me so much peace in that way. But one time when the follow-up coordinator called me, she forgot my son's name, and I felt like I was a number. I felt like she was doing something to check off the list. And I actually spoke at a conference and was telling this story just to educate, because as families, even the support that we provide, I'm sure we do lots of great things, but I'm sure there's lots of things that we can improve on also. And so as a parent, as we're sharing these things that we remember and experiences that we've had, it really is from a place to allow us together as a group to learn. And she happened to be sitting in the audience of that, and she came up
Oh
to me.
no.
Tracy, that was me. I'll never forget that day. I knew as soon as it came out of my mouth that I would change it in a heartbeat. And so it was a learning. It gives me chills still telling the story today. So I think it's an amazing service and program, but really making sure it comes from a genuine place.
Absolutely. And Rebecca?
Yes, my hospital had bereavement follow up as well, which I really appreciated. And thankfully, they always seem to remember Jonathan's name. Just to add a little negativity to that, I agree with Tracy. I think we learn from our mistakes. And she happened to call the day of Jonathan's funeral, and she heard a lot of background noise because we had tons of people at the house. We actually were at my parents' house, and so she made a comment about, "Wow, it sounds like that you've got a lot of celebrating going on. I sure hope you're getting your rest." And I was trying to explain to her why I don't really think we're celebrating. This is just, there's a lot of people in the house because this is the meal after the funeral. And yeah, there are a lot of people here. So I remember that kind of rubbing me the wrong way. And I took that as she was telling me how to grieve. And we've already touched on that a little bit, but I think that that's one thing we want to be real careful is never to impose on someone how they should or should not be grieving.
Very good point. Very good point.
Thank you, Joyce, for asking those questions. I think that's important
Mm-hmm.
and appreciated. Okay,
Yeah.
so I know both of you, Joyce and Rebecca, have shared some amazing and identified some gaps that we could work on. And both of you have shared some amazing action steps in as you shared those. But if we could come back together, and Joyce, if you would share just a couple action steps that you feel would help us bridge these gaps in bereavement care, that would be a great next step.
Absolutely. I think, like I said earlier, that the most powerful force is the power of the patient's story and the advocacy that parents have been able to demonstrate as a result of their losses. So I think that if we look at a cycle of how we can perpetuate change and bridging gaps to providing care, looking at that parent and their story and their ability to become that staunch advocate in the future. I think what we need to do is we need to work on prenatal expectations. I think that providers need to have this conversation with their patients in the prenatal period. I think that we need to do better in hospitals as well in providing information to patients upon discharge, preparing them for what to expect when they get home, not only physical signs and symptoms and warning signs, maternal warning signs, and when to return to provider's care or to the emergency room even. We need to prepare them with their resources in the area. What do we have available for you? I think that what you were saying, Tracy, was a beautiful point that I'm going to probably put into practice here, is that when you're sharing community resources, 4 months, 6 months out, how appreciated that would be, because it's something that you wouldn't have necessarily noticed while you were reading through your packet that you were discharged with, if you even had the opportunity to do so at that point. So I like that. But definitely the grief of partners as well, and the grief of grandparents. I think we need to prepare our patients who have experienced that loss, that everybody is grieving differently and will grieve differently, and how complex that journey is for a partner and for parents, grandparents included. It's very complex when you're grieving for the loss of your grandchild, and then you're grieving for your child who's lost their child, and a partner who's grieving in their own way, but are charged with the expectation of taking care of their partner who lost the child and being strong for them. So they're fearful of showing their grief. So many couples will separate after the loss of a child, and many couples will become stronger. But I think that expectation of the way a partner is going to grieve may look very different from how you're grieving, and because they're not talking about it doesn't mean they're not feeling it. There's some people who need to talk more than other people need to talk, so those differences need to be explained as well. And then when to reach out for help. I think that that's really important. One of the things that I always taught my patients upon discharge is that it's okay to not want to get out of bed. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to not want to eat. It's okay to not want to take care of yourself. But over the course of time, there should be some improvement in how somebody is feeling, but that if they continue to feel that they're in a dark, dark place and can't get out of it, we need to know what resources to be able to provide them with so that they can get help that they need.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of those areas, Joyce. And as you were speaking, I'm over here nodding my head. Yes, yeah. It was all information that we learned along the way that would have been powerful to have at the time. So, Rebecca, what are some action steps that you would present to help bridge the gaps?
Well, I think Joyce, like you, Tracy, I'm nodding my head over here as well. And I think Joyce pretty much covered everything. Really what we're doing today is we're listening to lost moms. We're listening to a healthcare provider. And I think that that's just for everybody to be open to education and not, I've had a hospital say, oh no, we already know what we're doing. Well, interestingly, on our intake sheets, when families come to our support groups, we don't make this public, but I'm privy to know which hospital they delivered. And would you know that the hospital that is so confident that they're doing everything correctly is the hospital where I would hear the most complaints about. And so I think just never think that you're doing everything right and you don't need further education. Listen to the moms and be open to that education, not only from a clinical perspective, but from a personal perspective as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right. Well, I want to give you both a chance to share any closing thoughts that you have. Joyce, would you like to go first? Any closing thoughts?
Certainly. Thank you. I would like to just let everybody know that be aware that you will become part of the change in bereavement care. I go back to the power of that patient story and being charged with becoming an advocate. I think that parents are able to feel strong and empowered when they start to advocate in this area. We've seen such incredible changes in the area of bereavement care over the years as a result of the power of the patient story. So no, you will become part of the change. You will become the narrative voice. So advocate. Look for areas where you can apply your energies and your passion and to reach out to other parents to help to support them through this. It's a very special group that you are a part of, women and families who have lost children. Know that the people who care for you never forget you. And I'm sorry, I'm going to get a little emotional, but we don't forget you. You touch our lives in very, very profound ways. So know that we take a piece of you forward with us in our practice, and with every experience with a family going through a loss, we take what we've learned and we're able to bring it to another family. So continue the conversation. Don't ever stop advocating, and just be powerful and be the change that we need to see in this area.
Well, thank you, Joyce. I have chills here as I say we echo that statement to you.
Mm-hmm.
The nurses and staff, and I mean, honestly, everyone that was there throughout our journey really allowed us to grieve, to what I say, they were easily the hardest days of my life. And so we appreciate the work that you do and being part of our story. So thank you. Rebecca, what are some closing thoughts you have for us today?
Well, before I answer that question, Joyce, again, just made me think of a personal story of how the healthcare providers never forget us. Several years after my Jonathan was stillborn, probably at least 10, maybe even 15 years later, I was at a place in Dallas, actually a place where I used to take all of my spring cleaning, clean out my closet things. And so one of the volunteers there at this ministry, she came up to me and she said, "What is your name?" And I said, "Rebecca Mitchell." And she said, "Can I ask you a really crazy, awkward question?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Did you deliver a stillborn baby several years ago?" And she named the hospital. And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I was one of your nurses." And I can't tell you the emotions that I was flooded with. She told me that she was in the delivery room, and she told me that she was one of the nurses who took care of me. I vaguely remembered her, but what I was really thinking of is, oh, she saw my Jonathan. She held my Jonathan. She remembers my Jonathan, even after all these years. And I just can't tell you what that meant to me. So, yes, Joyce, on behalf of all of us parents who have lost a baby, thank you so much for your love and your care and your tenderness toward parents like us. But to answer the thank you. But to answer the question, when I speak at hospitals, I always include in my presentation, and normally when I speak, I'm speaking to nurses and doctors and such, and I tell them, I charge them with this thought of, you can make a horrible situation a little bit better or a whole lot worse. And I hope you are determined to be one who makes this horrible situation a little bit better. And I think that charge is applicable not just to healthcare providers, but to any of us when we walk alongside someone who has gone through a loss or a tragedy, whether we're a neighbor or a family member or a parent or in whatever capacity we know that person. And so I think it's just so important to watch our words and our actions, and to acknowledge that loss and not try to offer answers, because oftentimes there are no answers, but just to be a listening ear and someone just to express their sorrow and sadness alongside that person.
It's a very powerful charge, Rebecca. I love that. So it's time for us to conclude our webinar today, and I think we could probably all agree we could continue this discussion for hours upon days with lots of topics in lots of different areas of that bereavement care. But unfortunately, we do have to end for today. But thank you, Joyce and Rebecca. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the work that you do on a daily basis. You know, in reading your bios, we know that the work that you do may look very different, but you both do very powerful and important work. And we are really making a profound impact on not just the current families we serve, but really the families who are going to come next, the families that are going to walk through that door tomorrow, a year, 10 years from now, and honestly, years down the road, experiencing that loss. So having you both today, I like to say at the table together, really helps us perpetuate that change in the right direction. I hope that we can continue this conversation. And Joyce, I'm going to utilize your words, but really empowering people to continue this narrative beyond today is crucial as we continue this work. So those of you who are those of you who are joining us, please make sure to check out the NICU Parent Network, their site, to learn more about the incredible parent-led organizations who are working every day to improve support for families and the professionals who care for them. And also make sure to check out the National Perinatal Association to view some of the amazing work that's being done. If you have any questions or would like to follow up with myself or either of our amazing presenters today, please contact us. Our emails are on the screen. Thank you so much for attending today. Please watch our websites for upcoming webinars, and we hope to see you on our next webinar.